Seated. I remember walking into the church offices right around the corner here to Kelly, the parish administrator, one Monday morning soon after I had started at St. James, almost 4 years ago. I'd been here maybe 1 or 2 Sundays. I said, "So who's the man in the red suspenders?" Who would have ever guessed the man he was to us and to the countless lives that are lived more fully because Bob Warren lived among us? Who would ever guess because he was so unassuming in his plaid shirt and those red suspenders? Bob wrote his own obituary. I hope you will read it if you haven't. I love how it speaks of his early life. He names his parents Manny and T. Baker Warren and his dear siblings Tommy and Mary Jo. And he sums up his entire childhood in the memory of his siblings taking him for rides in a cart pulled by a goat. Bob loved his people and his place, Allendale, South Carolina. He went off to school and he soaked in a tremendous education, and then he took it back to his people and his place. And the legal work that Bob Warren performed in his life is nothing less than extraordinary. It should be an example to an entire profession about the difference in a career and a vocation. Bob Warren did not have a job as a lawyer. He had a call to be a lawyer. His work was wrapped up existentially with his humanity, with his understanding of who he was in the cosmic order of the universe. He understood his faith in a Christ, not that saved a few, but that turned over tables of corruption that all might experience the fullness of life. I know this place is overflowing in this moment with the gathered spirits that lived more fully and got a shot at equity, that at least knew someone cared because Bob Warren chose not to practice law but to live it. Therein he made life an adventure of color. Therein, Bob brightened everything. Bob Warren hung out a humble shingle and did not give a lick if he got paid for his work because he knew there was a higher reward for us all. As his dear friend and law partner Lewis Pitts named, Bob understood that an injury to one is an injury to all. That equity and justice was a gift to the oppressed and the privileged alike. One of the privileges of my life is being beside people as they leave this life. Bob walked slowly into his eternity as his body gave, but his mind remained brilliant and clear. Over the last year, I have been washed over in stories of Bob's life. It is what he asked of Julie as the volume of his voice was lost to a whisper. Almost telepathically, he would whisper and Julie would nod and understand and recount the story he wanted remembered in that moment. And Julie would lock her eyes on his and remember the stories of his vocation and his life and call down the spirits of those that suffered from the fixed utility rates in the 1980s and the hundreds of spirits of the former Savannah River site workers and their relatives who suffered illnesses from working in the radioactive complex. Those cases are still pending, and might our prayer be that people who will never know Bob's name still beyond his death benefit from his work. And there are countless spirits, black and white and native, who stayed in their trailers and homes because Bob Warren fought their foreclosures at the hand of banks advantaging the circumstances of the poor. And the spirit of Eddie Hatcher and Timothy Jacobs of the Tuscarora tribe of the First Nation, who Bob defended for holding 17 hostages in Lumberton in the offices of the Robinsonian newspaper because they wished an audience with the governor to name the corruption and drug dealing among law enforcement officials that affected their people directly and tragically. Bob wore a bulletproof vest in Lumberton, and his windshield was shot out. Bob took the side of union workers and families and single moms. The ceremonial sage we are burning here today was gifted to Bob from the First Nation. He came to the aid of the Lumbees, the Tuscaroras, and the Cherokees, and he saved the sage. He wanted it burned as he lay dying and leaving this world. Sage, of course, is used to smudge and to purify, which was what Bob did with his life. The world is pure and better because of the man in the red suspenders. Now, just to be sure that you all know why he wore those suspenders, that is one of the great Bob Warren stories. Bob was well aware of the privilege of those with high degrees of the professional class. He was aware of the power differential and how that was expressed without words and in the courtroom, in the professional dress versus the dress of his clients. So Bob refused to wear a necktie because he wanted to be very clear whose side he was on. And so it was a client that gave Bob his first pair of red suspenders. It is most appropriate that Bob's family chose to mark and remember the words of Isaiah as we mark and remember his life today. Those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. Bob's faith was not that for his religion he would soar. It was a hope that the oppressed of every religion, of every race, would soar into the fullness of their own being. That was Bob's Jesus, Bob's understanding of God. That is the faith he lived, that there is a dwelling place for everyone, not in some heaven one day, but now, immediately in this life. Bob lived preparing a place for all, realizing heaven here and now. The land of no more separation for Bob Warren was not in heaven one day. It was what we are to create right here and right now. Bob was able to wear his red suspenders and make heaven here possible because he had heaven in his life, which was you, Julie, who Bob named the love of his life. And that heaven was stretched to his beloved daughters, Riley and White. Let's see, where is she? There you are. And to Dan and Matt. You had a childhood like few others. Bob and Julie put lives together for you even as they were building a life together. Bob supported Julie to attend law school. And while Bob carried on his practice, they celebrated dance performances. And you all attended no nuke rallies and protested at nuclear plants. Bob made pancakes and showed up for out of town for school plays. He threw the baseball back and forth with a reluctant stepson every warm day while his mother was earning her law degree in Boston. And when the first rainy day came, and it was the worst day, it was Bob that thought up the brilliant idea that they could go to the subway and throw the ball back and forth, which they did for every rainy day that came. The children all spoke of how they did not suffer from their father's generosity and financial choices. Athletic equipment appeared when it was needed. College tuition was paid. Bob did not hesitate to drive across the country in a snowstorm to deliver a much-needed car, and waited vigil to hold his newborn grandchildren, Flora and William and Cairo and Joseph and Somer and Brian and Kate and Jillian. Bob liked to say with Julie, "Ain't life rich? Ain't life rich?" You were the riches of his life. Bob's love and fire and bravery and devotion did not exist in isolation. It was nurtured and supported and given when by you, Julie. Of course, you two met in a civil disobedience class. And you bought in for the ride of your life with Bob Warren. Your love story is intertwined with a love story for how we can practically love everyone. Bob was confined to his house for most of the last year, and it was you, Julie, who tenderly and beautifully cared for him and walked with him to his death. It was extraordinary to witness how you read and understood his needs as his voice and body diminished, telling him the stories of his life. In case I've made Bob out to be a complete saint, he would like, I am sure, for me to share this story. Near the beginning of their relationship, Bob and Julie took a train trip across Canada. When they got off at Lake Louise, Bob spotted a sign offering guided tours on horseback. Bob was all in. Julie, not so much. Bob was, not surprisingly, persuasive. Julie told the guide she had never ridden a horse. The guide responded, "Well, then I'll get you a horse that's never been rode before." It was quite a ride along a dramatically steep cliff to a tea house in the mountains. When Julie finally got off the horse at the top of the mountain, she had her tea and then refused to get back on the horse. She walked back to camp. Therever after, if ever Bob Warren was not listening to his spouse, all she had to say was, "Remember the horse ride in Canada." Bob's body diminished in his final days, but not his eyes. Those brilliant blue eyes locked on you when you walked in the room. And he stared clear and unafraid, holding what it is that is between us as human beings, which is the precious thing called life that we share. That is love. It was just beautiful, the love that swelled as Bob lay dying, and you, Julie, loved him to the end. Bob's final words to you were, "Thank you for taking care of me." I want to thank you for the privilege of witnessing you taking care of him. A.D. Anderson, Bob's dear friend, and Lewis Pitts both shared with me a sentiment that the world has lost a true advocate and friend. But all is not lost. our beloved Bob still is, because you, his dear family and friends, still are. You live on. We carry the torch that is his spirit, and I do not think it is happenstance that in his death we are walked to the door of our own opportunity to love as we have never loved before. It would not be lost on Bob Warren that the poor and the sick and the elderly stand to suffer the direst consequences of the COVID-19 virus. We have been asked to create between us, as a way to contain the virus, space, to make space. And we must take this seriously, because not all of us stand to ride out this virus without physical and economic consequences. We must love in this moment by creating space. And in that space, we must live as Bob Warren lived, unafraid, eyes fixed, ever finding ways to fill the space between us with love. Ain't that rich? Ain't that rich? Ain't that rich? May it be so.